So in our previous parts, we discussed the scheming House Merryweather, who in part 1 we established are most likely Aegon supporters based on the family history, their exile, and Taena's knowledge of the gold coin in Rugen's cell. And in part 2, we furthered this notion by analyzing Cersei 4 and finding that Orton Meriwether downplayed the Golden Company while wanting to give power to the Redwynes. And in part 3, we discussed why the Redwynes' twin problem and inheritance opportunities make them prime candidates to support the Aegon cause. And in part 4, we discussed why the Redwyne twins were hanging around with Margaery and her cousins, specifically pointing out the opportunities that would arise in the Reach in securing good relations with House Bulwer and House Beesbury. At its heart, the Merryweathers' entire manipulation of Cersei, the compliments, the sharing of sinister thoughts, and even the tolerating of the Mirish Swamp incident are all for the eventual goal of the conquest of Westeros by Aegon. In fact, let's take a look at the map and talk about the Golden Company's invasion, because there are some fascinating aspects to it. So on the east coast of Westeros, we have the last holdouts of Stannis' forces. They are at Dragonstone and Storm's End. Now yes, these are Stannis holdings, but specifically, Dragonstone is held by Roland Storm, the bastard of Nightsong, who claims to be the Lord of Nightsong in the Stormlands after his half-brother was killed and Nightsong was given to House Foot. Storm's End is held by Gilbert Faring and Lord Elwood Meadows of the Grassy Vale. And around the time of Cersei 4, we hear about the Redwyne fleet heading to take Dragonstone and part of the fleet blockading Storm's End. And also in Cersei 4, we hear of a Tyrell host, under the command of Mace Tyrell and Mathis Rowan, besieging Storm's End. So this is essentially the layout around the time of Cersei 4, and Cersei 4 is an interesting moment in our story because it's in this chapter that we find out that the Golden Company is marching to Volantis, where they will consider the prospects of invasion in the Lost Lord chapter. And this is important because at this point in our story, the Redwyne fleet is well in position to stop their invasion, especially the portion in Shipbreaker Bay blockading Storm's End. And yet, the Redwyne fleet is never given any consideration by the Golden Company. Not once. For some reason, the Golden Company has no fear of them. This is quite notable as Jon Conn's landing site for the Golden Company is a stretch of land by the Rainwood that is part of Griffin Roost's land. That is, right here. The Golden Company's plan was to land thousands of men astoundingly close to the Redwyne fleet. So close, in fact, that a chance gust of wind would blow the Golden Company right into the Redwynes. In fact, wind did blow the fleet all around during the landing, with ships landing all the way up at Tarth and down by Estermont. One would think that there would be some worry of opposing fleets in the area, and yet the Golden Company goes forward without caution. Now, by the time of the actual invasion, the Redwyne fleet is in fact gone, as is most of the Tyrell host, and this is because of the events of Cersei 7, 8, 9, and 10, which all happen in the span of about a couple of weeks. In Cersei 7, the Crown hears of Euron's attack on the Shield Islands, and Loras leaves the next morning to Dragonstone, a short sail away, and supposedly immediately attacks the castle, and then Arrayne Waters returns after the battle in Cersei 8, and then 3 more days pass in the chapter, which ends with Cersei formulating her plan to implicate Osney with Margaery. Now, we don't know exactly how long there is between Cersei 8 and 9, but it probably isn't too long, as in Cersei 9, Cersei tells Osney to go confess to the High Sparrow, and in Cersei 10, Margaery is arrested, followed by Cersei the next day. All in all, Cersei 7 to 10 is about 2 weeks, give or take a few days. Now, it's tough to say exactly where the Golden Company is during this eventful fortnight, but in the Watcher chapter, we hear about the Golden Company being in Weiss, and the Dornish don't know yet of Margaery or Cersei's arrests. And in the first Arianna chapter, we hear of the Redwynes passing through the Stepstones first, followed by the Golden Company right after. So it seems that when Cersei's 7 through 10 happen, the Golden Company is sitting in Weiss. Now, regarding the Redwyne fleet leaving the area, this happens because Euron attacks the Shield Islands, and in Cersei 7, Cersei is requested by the Tyrells to send the Redwyne fleet to deal with the Ironborn. And it's actually Orton Meriwether who fights against the Redwyne's dispatch. First, he claims that the Ironborn threat is exaggerated. 1,000 ships! Sir Harry Swift was wheezing. Surely not. No lord commands 1,000 ships. Some frightened fool has counted double, agreed Orton Meriwether. That or Lord Tyrell's bannermen are lying to us, puffing up the numbers of the foe so we will not think them lax. Then after this, he agrees with Cersei's crazy theory that this is some sort of secret Stannis ploy. Stannis may have had a hand in this. Balon Greyjoy offered my lord father an alliance. Perhaps his son has offered one to Stannis. Pycelle frowned. What would Lord Stannis gain by... He gains another foothold, and plunder, that as well. Stannis needs gold to pay his sellswords. By raiding in the west, he hopes he can distract us from Dragonstone and Storm's End. Lord Merryweather nodded. A diversion. Stannis is more cunning than we knew. Your Grace is clever to have seen through his ploy. Now, it's notable that Merryweather is once again concerned with the affairs of the Redwynes. He wanted a Greyjoy alliance, something that would put their ships under the command of Paxter Redwyne, and now he wants to keep the Redwyne ships east. And it's a strikingly odd position to be against the dispatch of the Redwyne fleet. Publicly, Merryweather is a Tyrell bannerman who previously called Stannis desperate and who downplayed any threat of invasion from the east. Why on earth would he be against this movement? Yes, Cersei has an irrational fear of Stannis and is reluctant to help the Tyrells, but why would Orton Meriwether be against the move? Now, perhaps Orton is simply a sycophant who says what he believes Cersei wants to hear, but this all does support the idea that the Redwynes and the Golden Company are aligned, and Orton wanted the Redwynes to be able to assist them. Though admittedly, the Golden Company also never laments the Redwynes leaving the area or talks about them being allies. Whatever the case, Cersei only allows the Redwyne fleet to go west if Dragonstone is dealt with, and so Loras heads to Dragonstone, and in Cersei 8 the island is purportedly taken, freeing the fleet. Now, also in Cersei 7, Cersei clues Taena into the fact that the Tyrell forces at Storm's End may soon move back to King's Landing based on something she's about to do, that is, accuse Margaery of adultery. And Taena asks again about the Tyrell forces at Storm's End in Cersei 9 as she helps lead Cersei towards finally accusing Margaery of a crime. The Merryweathers certainly knew that the Tyrell host would be moving ahead of time. Now let's assume I've been wrong about everything, and these movements are not influenced or informed by an Aegon agent, but instead are just happenstance. After all, in the Griffin Reborn chapter, the Golden Company acts like the arrests of Cersei and Margaery are news to them, and they never discuss the Redwynes. Well, if it is luck, it's insanely good luck. Over the top good luck. The Redwyne fleet was prowling Shipbreaker Bay near the landing site for the Golden Company, and sails away just before the Golden Company's arrival, and then the Tyrell host leaves as well, allowing Storm's End to become central to the Golden Company's strategy. It's a base to retreat to and a symbol of their strength, according to Jon Con. Had the Golden Company made their trip just 2 weeks earlier, none of this would have been possible. Their fleet would have run into the Redwyne fleet, and the Tyrell host would have been right there to take Griffin's Roost, to nip Connington's invasion in the bud. If we are to assume that these forces are seen as hostile and sedentary, it's outrageously reckless that the Golden Company would have chosen their landing spot, and it's outrageously convenient that these forces would move away just as the Golden Company invades. In fact, let's go into some more depth on this invasion because right now, things are looking pretty good for the Golden Company, especially if we assume Redwyne and Blackfyre support. So we know from the Griffin Reborn chapter and the Ariana sample chapters that half of the Golden Company's forces have landed on Cape Wrath, with Rainhouse, Crow's Nest, Mistwood, Griffin's Roost, and Estermont all falling to the Golden Company. Additionally, Weeping Town seems to have gone over to Aegon, and Tarth seems to have been conquered. Now, we hear nothing of Stonehelm, but Jaime specifically calls out House Swan for having wavering loyalties and suspiciously sending no soldiers into battle, so they will likely not cause too much trouble for Aegon. After that, there's Blackhaven. Its Lord Beric Dondarrion, though actually dead, is still believed to be alive and an outlaw against the crown, so the Castellan may see Aegon as a friendly alternative. And then there's Nightsong, the strategic castle at the end of the Prince's Pass. Nightsong has been held by House Foot since the Blackwater, but the small folk soldiers, those running the castles and the like, are likely to still support House Cairn. Which brings us to Roland Storm, the man Stannis left in charge of Dragonstone. His story is largely told in the appendix, where it says he claims to be the Lord of Nightsong. Now it's likely our author included this information for a reason, and Roland Storm's claim will come into our story. And here's the thing, even though the main fleet has left, a red wine force should be in control of Dragonstone at the moment, which means they have Roland Storm. If the red wines are aligned with Aegon and they have Roland Storm of House Cairn, he may be able to influence the soldiers of Nightsong to overthrow their new lords the Foots for an Aegon supporting Cairn. Next, we should talk about the other half of the Golden Company and the Elephants, which are missing. Considering that some forces have landed on Tarth, it's likely that the other half of Jon Con's forces have landed north and east of Storm's End. Around them we have House Fell of Fellwood. The fate of their castle is a mystery. Their lord left with Stannis North and died, though no one in the south likely knows this. There's also Bronzegate, the seat of House Buckler. Although Buckler was at Joffrey's wedding, toasting him, his cousin went north with Stannis, so it's likely the house started out as Renly supporters, then switched to Stannis, and then were forced to bend the knee to Joffrey. And there's also House Errol of Haystack Hall, Renly supporters who switched to Stannis. So none of these three houses seem to have a strong love for the Lannisters, and they likely won't cause Jon Con any trouble. Which brings us to Storm's End. Now, Mace Tyrell did leave behind a token force. Chances are it's being led by Mathis Rowan. He goes with Mace Tyrell to Storm's End, and he's not seen when Mace Tyrell returns to King's Landing. Now, Mathis Rowan is the Lord of Golden Grove in the Reach, and was a Targaryen loyalist. Notably, he looks sick in A Storm of Swords when Tywin Lannister brings up the deaths of Rhaegar's children. Additionally, as it happens, Mathis Rowan is married to Bethany Redwine. That's the same Bethany Redwine that the Blackfish refused to marry. And Mathis Rowan is seen conspiring with Paxter Redwine about something in A Feast for Crows. So it looks like Mathis Rowan is likely to defect, but even if he's captured, he'll be forced to bend the knee. Only his death would complicate things, leaving Golden Grove in the hands of his children. Nonetheless, chances are Golden Grove will be under Aegon's control. And then there's Storm's End itself. Jon Con is claiming he will take the castle by a trick of some sort. Assuming he's successful, he will get a hold of Lord Elwood Meadows, which means the Grassy Vale would be forced to bend the knee. And so this covers all of the major sites on the map in the Stormlands, and as we can see, the Golden Company's conquest of the Stormlands is pretty well assured. And on top of this, we can see that by taking castles in the Stormlands, it affects the Reach. Now, of course, in the Reach, there's the Merryweathers Castle, Longtable, and there's the Arbor. And as we talked about last time, the Redwines may be able to pull in House Bulwer and House Beesbury with marriages to the Redwine twins. So as we talked about in Part 3, Laswell Peake says he has friends in the Reach dating back to his family's exile, which happened after the Second Blackfyre Rebellion. Now, we actually know who some of these friends likely were, as they were invited to the Frey Butterwell wedding in the Mystery Night. Of the invitees, there's House Costain of Three Towers, House Qui of Sun House, and House Caswell of Bitterbridge, though the Golden Company can probably forget about House Caswell, as Aegon's Kingsguard knight Raleigh Duckworth has a very bad history with them. There are also houses that are identified as those who supported both sides in the Blackfyre Rebellion, essentially houses that wanted to back the winners. According to Eustace Osgrey in The Sworn Sword, that includes House Oakhart and House Hightower. Considering that so many of Hightower's bannermen may be Aegon supporters, they may have no choice but to support Aegon, despite Aleri Hightower being married to Mace Tyrell. Now, we aren't going to be correct about all of these houses supporting Aegon, but still, we can see that Highgarden is getting surrounded, and that's before considering the movements of Euron. So, in A Feast for Crows, Euron attacks the Shield Islands and then the Arbor, and we know this has caused Garland Tyrell to move some forces west, though he has no ships to actually reclaim the Shield Islands. The point is, Tyrell forces are moving away from Highgarden. Down in the Redwine Straits, Euron is about to have a battle against the Hightower fleet and the Redwine fleet. Now, Euron seems to be up to something, so he'll probably pull off an unexpected victory, which would leave Old Town in peril, meaning more Tyrell forces, either Garland or Willis, would need to move south, again, away from Highgarden. And although Euron is destroying Redwine ships that may have been useful to Aegon, it also makes the conquest of the Reach much easier. With the Grassy Vale and Longtable secure, the Golden Company essentially just has to deal with Cider Hall, which would bring joy to Franklin Flowers, and then they have a clear path to a near-defenseless Highgarden. Now, this covers the Reach, but what of the rest of the Seven Kingdoms? Well, things aren't as clear, but there are some good signs. The Golden Company certainly thinks Dorne will be behind them, but the truth is likely more complicated. Still, we know that one Dornish army is under the command of Lord Fowler in the Prince's Pass, and it needs to pass Night Song to cause any trouble. The other is in the Boneway, led by Lord Ironwood, and the Ironwoods were fervent Blackfyre supporters, so the Golden Company may be able to count on half the Dornish. Way up in the Vale, the Sunderlands, Blackfyre supporters, have been training in jousting and will likely secure spots on Sweet Robin's Guard, which may affect something. But it's really the Riverlands where the most interesting situation is. Yes, there are likely Blackfyre supporters among the Riverlanders, such as House Bracken, and I would argue that the Brotherhood Without Banners are secretly Aegon supporters. But there is also a fascinating situation happening at Harrenhal. You see, in Jaime 5, A Feast for Crows, Jaime informs Emmon Frey of the political situation in the Riverlands. "You are not his overlord, sir. Read your parchment. You were granted Riverrun with its lands and incomes. No more. Peter Baelish is the Lord Paramount of the Trident. Riverrun will be subject to the rule of Harrenhal." So it's important to note that Jaime speaks a small contradiction. Rule is simultaneously established as belonging to Littlefinger and Harrenhal. Now, in normal times when a lord is at his castle, there is no contradiction, but currently Littlefinger is in the Vale. So who rules the Riverlands? Well, we do find that in times of a missing lord, responsibilities of rule seem to fall on the Castellan. Bran, for example, rules the north as Castellan of Winterfell in A Clash of Kings, and Arnulf Karstark leads House Karstark as Castellan in A Dance with Dragons. So, who is Castellan of Harrenhal? Well, his name is Bonifer Hasty, and we actually meet him in Jaime 3. Jaime could not be certain who had convinced his sister that Sir Bonifer should be named Castellan of Harrenhal, but the appointment smelled of Orton Meriwether. Hasty had once served Merryweather's grandsire, he seemed to recall dimly, and the carrot-haired justiciar was just the sort of simple-minded fool to assume that someone called the Good was the very potion the Riverlands required to heal the wounds left by Roose Bolton, Vargo Hoat, and Gregor Clegane. That's right, the effective ruler of the Riverlands is an appointment suggested by Orton Meriwether. Now yes, if Littlefinger should return to the Riverlands, he should be Lord Paramount, but even Jaime notes that he is in no haste to make it back. In the short term, a Merryweather man, who happened to be madly in love with Aegon's grandmother, and whose house was invited to the Frey Butterwell wedding, meaning they're likely Blackfyres, is in control of a vital castle strategically and politically in charge of the Riverlands to boot. His rule will almost certainly aid Aegon. And this brings us to the end of our discussion of the Merryweathers and how they helped facilitate Aegon's landing and his eventual conquest of the Reach and the Riverlands. We shall see how much of this comes to pass, but it seems certain that Aegon will be in control of most of the Seven Kingdoms just in time for the arrival of Daenerys, so there can be a second Dance of the Dragons. And speaking of Dany, it's been a while since I've done a video on her, so I may return to that topic. So look for her next. Once again, I'm probably wrong about half of this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.